It might seem like a long time ago, but it's been just 18 months since the Washington Nationals were on top of the baseball world. Their not-so-underdog run to the World Series in 2019 capped off a decade of solid teams that just never performed in the postseason, but they were able to ride an excellent starting pitching staff to a title. Unfortunately, the follow-up season was pretty disappointing. Anthony Rendon went west, and while the two remaining Nats stars Trea Turner and Juan Soto were excellent, the rest of the offense regressed. Injuries to Steven Strasburg and underperformance from other pitchers, and a spotty bullpen led to a team ERA over 5, third worst in the NL. They finished the short season 26-34, tied for last in the NL East, missing the expanded playoffs. So are they blowing it up going into 2021? Do they have a shot at the playoffs? That's what we'll take a look at in today's video. In the offseason, the Nats were far from tanking, but also didn't make any world-breaking moves. They added some bats with high upside in Kyle Schwarber and Josh Bell, and supplemented their rotation with another veteran presence in Jon Lester. In the bullpen, they lost veteran Sean Doolittle, but added Brad Hand in free agency. I'd say overall, the team added more than it lost in the offseason. Considering how many Nats players underperformed or were injured last year, I wouldn't expect them to be worse than 2020, but let's go position by position to get a better idea of their playoff chances. Starting behind the plate, Yan Gomes is expected to get the plurality of starts, but veteran Alex Avila and rookie Trace Barrera will likely see some time as well. Gomes was above average at the plate last season, especially as catchers go, but his defense, particularly pitch framing, was a big step back from what he had showed in Cleveland earlier in his career. Gomes will be decent near the back of the Nats lineup, and if he can improve his defense back to his pre-2018 numbers, he could be a top 10 catcher in baseball. Unfortunately, entering his age 34 season, I don't think that's particularly likely. Projections peg him for around 1 WAR and 300 plate appearances, making him a perfectly league average player, which I'm pretty inclined to agree with. More compelling is the Nats' projected first baseman Josh Bell, who was acquired in a trade with the Pirates this offseason. He'll probably share time with franchise face Ryan Zimmerman, who will probably get the bulk of at-bats against left-handed pitching, since Bell's career WRC+ is 30 points lower against lefties, whereas Zimmerman's is 34 points higher. Bell showed he was capable of greatness in the first half of 2019, where he was one of the best players in the league with a 154 WRC+. Unfortunately, he's cratered back to earth with just a 97 combined WRC+ in the second half of 2019 and 2020. Bell has consistently hit the ball hard even when he stank last year, but in 2020 he had an average launch angle 7 points lower than 2019, which tanked his StatCast expected stats and likely his actual stats as well. Bell is also one of the worst defenders in the league at first base, so he needs to hit quite well to make up for that and be productive, shown by his not eclipsing 1 WAR in any season of his career except 2019. Pairing him with Zimmerman, who can cover his platoon splits, should be good at squeezing the value out of both players, but I certainly wouldn't expect either of them to be all-stars. If Bell can put the ball in the air more, we could see a return to near his 2019 form, but even if he does that, he needs to improve his defense or else he'll never be a very valuable player. He helps out the Nats lineup, which aside from a couple players was pretty bad last year, but I wouldn't expect a ton of production from Bell overall. Sliding over to second base, Washington is expected to start veteran Starlin Castro, who is pretty much a known quantity. He doesn't whiff or strike out very much, but the trade-off is he almost never walks and his bat doesn't have much pop. This leads to solid averages, but overall offensive numbers hovering around average. His defense at second base has been solid, if a little error-prone in the past, but was a little below average in a small sample size in 2020. Castro is a pretty unexciting player that'll give you around 1.5 WAR in a full season, and is a serviceable stopgap for prospect Luis Garcia, who has a similar hitting profile to Castro, and could take over the starting job as soon as this season. The Nats' projected third baseman is former top prospect Carter Kieboom, who is disappointed in 165 plate appearances in the majors, but raked through the minors and was scouted to have plus power and solid contact. So far, the only part of Kieboom's game that's delivered is his plate discipline, sporting a 13% career walk rate. Unfortunately, he's also struck out far more than expected, and his power hasn't shown at all, with 0 homers in 122 plate appearances last year. He didn't hit the ball hard at all, with an average exit velocity of 85 miles an hour, similar to guys like JP Crawford and Adam Frazier, which is definitely below his potential but hardly inspires confidence. On the other hand, he came up mostly as a middle infielder, so his defense at the hot corner should be solid, and in 2020 he was above average by DRS and UZR. Kieboom is getting his chance at full-time starts this year, which he deserves based purely on his top 20 prospect pedigree. The Kieboom that was hyped up could be a difference maker in the middle of the Nats order right now, but it's hard to say that's who we'll see based on his unimpressive major league career thus far. He's probably the biggest wildcard in the Nats order, since we've seen his floor, and it stinks, but he's definitely capable of above average production. If I had to take a shot in the dark, I'd say he starts slow but picks it up in the second half of the season once he settles in, ending the year with around a 100 WRC+, but your guess is as good as mine, honestly. Moving to shortstop, let's talk bona fide star Trea Turner. He quietly hit for a better WRC+ than both Fernando Tatis Jr. and Corey Seager last year, while still being one of the fastest players in the league and playing serviceable defense at short. The biggest adjustment he made was cutting his strikeout rate by 6% from 2019, which when you have game-changing speed like Turner is a huge boon. He's hit the ball hard his whole career, even in years where his offensive production was middling, so while I doubt he can replicate his 2020 over a full season, he could easily be a 300 hitter with 25 homers and 40 steals, basically a less powerful version of Fernando Tatis Jr. His biggest downside is the defense, which depending on the metric you ask ranged from mediocre to terrible in 2020. He's probably more of a second baseman, but without a replacement ready, the Nats will play him at shortstop, or as long as he's passable, he'll accrue a lot of value. Turner was one of the two bright spots for the Nats last season, and I expect him to continue to be their second best hitter on the team in 2021. So who's their best hitter going to be? Well, you and I both know it's Juan Soto, who's likely to be the everyday right fielder in Washington this year. In what amounts to a little more than 2 seasons of at-bats, Soto has been worth 11 WAR in his career, 14th in the league since his debut. His career 152 WRC+ is 5th in baseball in that time frame, and the names he's behind are hardly ones to be ashamed of. Not even to mention his absurd 201 WRC+ in 2020, best in baseball by a fair margin. This ridiculous offensive production is largely due to his great walk rate, which at 17% for his career ranks second in the league behind Mike Trout. In 2020, his 20% walk rate was once again the best in the league. That's not to take away from his absurd StatCast numbers though, which show he hit the ball as hard and as well as anybody else in the league last year. It's not fair to expect Soto to repeat 2020 over a full season, but the ZiPS projection system is predicting the 5th most WAR and 2nd highest OPS in all of baseball. While 200 WRC+ is probably a stretch for Soto in 2021, around 170 is far from out of the question, which would put him in the top 2 or 3 hitters in the league. His defense is pretty bad, but honestly with his production at the plate, you don't really care. Soto has been a great hitter, and all the numbers show it's sustainable and maybe even improvable, which is a scary thought. Oh yeah, he's only 22 years old. Good luck, baseball. Moving to center field, where former top prospect Victor Robles is our man. He got his first full-time shot in 2019 and was solid, with a mediocre 92 WRC+, but world-class defense in center. In 2020, though, he took a big step back both at the plate and in the field, with a 65 WRC+, and below-average defense by both DRS and UZR. His StatCast numbers went from uninspiring but fine in 2019 to dismal in 2020, not showing any sign of the prospect that flashed the ability to hit 290 with gap-to-gap power. They also show he lost a step both on defense and the bases, going from one of the 5 fastest players in the league in 2019 to just solid in 2020, which combined with his dip in outfield jump accounts for the defensive decline. So will he improve? Personally, I have no doubt his defense will get back to near his 2019 form very soon. Defensive metrics take multiple seasons to stabilize, so a third of a year worth of numbers is hardly a significant sample size. And Robles has all the pedigree of an elite defender. At the plate, though, it's hard to say. He might not ever be an above-average hitter, and although I'd love to be proven wrong, if his defense resurges, he doesn't really need to be. He could be the second coming of Kevin Kiermaier, which is a great consolation prize for the Nats. I'd be surprised if Robles doesn't have above-average production, all things considered, in 2021, even if his hitting isn't great. Our last hitter to talk about is former Cub Kyle Schwarber, who was non-tendered in the offseason and signed to a 1-year deal by the Nats. After a career year in 2019, he had the worst year of his career in 2020, largely off the back of an average launch angle 6 degrees lower than his career average. This caused a career worst BABIP and ugly StatCast numbers, despite a 95th percentile exit velocity and great hard hit and barrel percentages. It's pretty easy to attribute these to the small sample size of 2020, and peg Schwarber as a bounce-back candidate, which I think is fair. He'll hit around 240 with 30 homers and below-average defense and left, but for a team starved for impact bats like Washington, this is a good pickup. Something to look out for is his career WRC+ of just 75 against lefties. He's a prime candidate to be the strong side of a platoon, but the Nats don't really have any right-handed outfielders on the bench to complete it. We might see Josh Harrison, who has a career 108 WRC+ against lefties, get some time in the outfield. We are running a little low on time, so I'll try to talk about the pitching staff relatively briefly. Headlining the rotation is future Hall of Famer Max Scherzer, who had his worst season as a Nat last year but was still quite good. His biggest downfall was 3.1 walks per 9, which is still better than average but markedly worse than his career average as a Nat and his worst since 2010. Contact against him was harder than his past few seasons as well, but it is manageable, especially considering his excellent strikeout rates. Overall, Scherzer's time as one of the 3 best pitchers in the league is probably over, but if he can recapture his control, he should still be an ace for the next couple seasons. Next up is Steven Strasburg, who should be ready to pitch for Washington on opening day despite his injury struggles last year. He's had health issues, but has been the best number 2 starter in baseball when on the mound with a career 3.19 ERA, great walk and strikeout rates, and a nearly spotless postseason record. It's hard to say how well Strasburg will come back from wrist surgery, but he's come back fine from all his previous ailments and is just 32, hardly an old man, so I'd expect at least a couple more seasons of low 3 ERAs, and once he settles in and shakes off the rust, he should be a suitable second ace to go with Scherzer. Completing the Nats trifecta is Patrick Corbin, who had a disappointing 2020 with a 4.66 ERA off the back of the worst BABIP against of his career. His strikeout rate also plummeted, which is a bigger sign for concern, but his FIP and xFIP are noticeably better than his ERA, so he could see some positive regression in 2021. Corbin won't be a world beater, but I'd be very surprised if he wasn't a well above average pitcher next season, since he has the pedigree and the stuff to impress. Washington signed another veteran lefty in the offseason in John Lester, who took a 1-year deal. He's 37 and fresh off the worst year of his career, with all his peripherals trending in the wrong direction. Lester doesn't strike anybody out, so a large portion of his game is based on inducing soft contact, which he was pretty bad at last year. Overall, I think Lester will be fine to eat innings, but they will probably be below average innings. The rest of the Nats starts will go to a combination of Joe Ross, Eric Fetty, and Austin Voth, who are all pretty similar in that they'll probably pitch to about a 5 ERA with below average strikeouts as a starter, but might be a little more successful out of the bullpen. They're fine depth guys, but nothing to get excited about. A big issue with Washington recently has been their bullpen. Outside of Sean Doolittle, they haven't had a reliever with multiple successful seasons in recent memory. They lost Doolittle in the offseason, but replaced him with Brad Hand, who's been the better pitcher since 2019. He'll make up the back end of the bullpen with Tanner Rainey, who throws triple digits and was quite good in 2020, and Daniel Hudson, who was the closer through their World Series run but disappointed last year. Will Harris, who had a good ERA but not great peripherals in 2020, will also pitch some leverage innings. These 4 pitchers should comprise a decent back end of a bullpen, although it definitely isn't a strong point of the team. So, overall, what's the verdict? Well, the lineup is still top-heavy. It'll be very dependent on Juan Soto, Trea Turner, and maybe now Kyle Schwarber to produce runs. A lot of the projected starters like Castro, Robles, and Gomes are just not that likely to be good hitters, which is not a great recipe for a good offense. Although it's possible Soto will be so good that it won't even matter. The bench and depth is also far from inspiring, mostly made up of over-the-hill veterans and unproven rookies. Continuing the theme of top-heaviness, the rotation is the same way. Scherzer, Strasburg, and Corbin on their own are good enough to make this a top 10 rotation, but Lester and the rest of the starters probably are not going to produce much. I really like the Brad Hand pickup, but it doesn't exactly make the bullpen elite. There still isn't a high enough density of consistent arms to make it a selling point for the team. The Nats are one of the teams that has the highest variance in the league in my eyes. They could win or lose 95 games, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised either way, and if a lot breaks right, they could easily be a playoff contender. But I think a more likely outcome is around 82 to 84 wins. While the team has big-name stars like Soto, Turner, Scherzer, and Strasburg, outside of them there aren't many young or high-upside players. The team is mostly comprised of older bounce-back candidates or total known quantities. While sneaking into the playoffs would be much more likely in a weak division, sharing a division with the likes of the Braves and Mets, who I view as superior teams, makes the Nats' path to the postseason very difficult. I definitely wouldn't rule out a playoff run, but one injury to a key player could pretty much derail the whole season, especially when you compare their depth to Atlanta and New York. There's a lot to look forward to this season for Nats fans, and I'd expect a meaningful baseball well into September. But ultimately, I just do not think they have the pieces for a playoff run this season. Thanks for sticking around. I want to do in-depth preseason analyses for more of these bubble-type teams, so if you have any in particular you want me to make, let me know in the comments. Only about 20% of my viewers are subscribed, so it helps me out a ton to sub to the channel if you're enjoying the content. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.